Hey, it's Father Roderick, and I am here to share with you day 3 of my journey towards writing my own fantasy novel. Now, today I've started to conceptualize, to kind of like structure and come up with ideas for the prologue of my book. Now, this is something that you see often in fantasy novels. The prologue has a very specific function, and that is to kind of plunge you into the action. It is similar to what happens in Star Wars, for instance, in the first shot where you see this big Star Destroyer coming overhead, following this tiny little ship of the rebels. And it doesn't really introduce you to the main characters. Luke is down below on the planet of Tatooine, but you still get an immediate image of, oh wait, there is a tiny ship, there is a huge, massive, dangerous Imperial Star Destroyer. And so it sets the tone. It gives you like an immediate introduction to what's at stake, although you may not truly understand what's going on, but it shows you kind of the scope and the kind of story that you can expect. So the reason that I'm writing the prologue right now, even though there's a lot to say for writing the prologue, maybe even after you finish the entire story or the entire book, but for me, it's also a way to do this for myself, to paint a mental picture of what kind of world am I creating? How does it feel? What do you see? How does it even smell? And the first thing I wanted to establish in the prologue is that we are in a medieval, but also kind of a magical version of I would say Ireland, or a country that feels like Ireland. And this is not by accident, because as I mentioned in previous videos, I've been to Ireland just recently to film a documentary series, and I was very inspired by these beautiful stories about ancient saints and the miracles that they did. And my question that triggered my creativity was, well, what if all that was true? What if that world truly existed, where saints could do magical things, and maybe there were other things that were magical that were not part of the history and the stories that we know. So anyway, and I tried to kind of visualize, what is this world? What does it look like? And so I knew that in the prologue, I wanted to introduce the antagonist. The hero is still nowhere to be found, he's not important, but this is what I wanted to show, is an example of the evil that was happening. So the problem, it's like, why does the world needs saving, right? And so I started by, and I'm going to reveal a little bit about the story that I have in my mind, even though it's still very early in the whole process, so it may change over time. But my idea was, we follow this mysterious antagonist. We don't know it's an antagonist yet. It's a person who enters a town at night, or late at night. It's raining, it's cold outside, he seems miserable, and he just walks towards an inn that he sees, where light is shining from the windows. It's probably very warm, and you hear music coming from inside. But the music is like very repetitive. It's almost like it's on a loop. And so he enters, feels the warmth, and he sees in the middle of the tavern a group of people in a circle around a figure sitting on a, I don't know, a chair or whatever, or a box, and that person is making like almost like ritual movements with his hands. And what is striking to us as readers, but not to the antagonist, is that everything in the tavern seems to be on a loop. Like the guy behind the bar, he's making the same circular motion. He's looking in the distance. He's not really there, but he's just continuing to make that same movement. The music is on a loop. Even the flames of the fire seem to dance, but they dance in the same pattern. There's one exception. There's a cat at the feet of this figure in the center of the circle. And the cat looks up. I was like, who are you? and looks straight at our antagonist. The antagonist is ignoring the cat, and he's also not at all surprised by this strange kind of almost stasis that everyone is in. In fact, he walks up to the bar and he takes the mug with beer that the bartender has just put in front of a client, and he drinks the glass, he empties the glass, and then he walks up to the fire, and while he is heading towards the fireplace, he grabs a plate from the table in front of another guest in the inn, sits down at the fire, takes off his coat, and starts eating the food. Everything around him, nobody notices him, nobody seems to be aware that he's doing that, nobody's protesting that he's taking the food, or stealing the food, basically. And then once he is warm and he's replenished, he stands up, and he walks towards the central figure. And then this is kind of an idea that I have, but I'm not sure how I'm going to describe it. But at one point, he performs some kind of ritual. And it's just a ritual. I want this to be almost like a magical ritual or a liturgical ritual, right? And so he does something, and what happens, the effect that I wanted to have, is that he drains the color from the face of this central figure. So what is actually going on here, and this is like in the back of my mind, I know this, but the reader doesn't know, you don't know this yet. Why is everyone in stasis? Well, the person in the center is what is called a story mage. And these are traveling people, men and women, and what they do is they go to places where people gather, and this can be an inn, like here, but also later on in the story, this is just an idea that I came up with this morning. I wrote it down. I was like, okay, I need to find another scene or moment where I'm going to do this. This also happens in churches. So you also have people when they gather in church, where normally you would have a sermon, right, or a homily, a story mage, or maybe there are religious story mages as well. When they start telling a story, what happens is that everybody who is listening gets sucked into the story spell. And they enter what I call now temporarily story stasis, which means everything is on hold. As long as the story is being told, they are in the story, but the world around them kind of stops or is put on pause or in a loop. Because obviously you don't want accidents to happen when someone is like cooking something and then all of a sudden is in trance. The house would burn down. However, this is a restricted radius around the storyteller. So if you're not listening to the story, hence this is why the cat is the only creature in the tavern that is not in trance, because cats don't understand stories. But if you're outside of the range of the storyteller, everything else just continues. This gave me another idea, and I kind of was making this up on the spot while I was typing away. I think this could be an amazing element for later on, when, for instance, a band of brigands or like an enemy could send like corrupted story mages ahead to get people under their spell. So they could, for instance, if everybody is in church on Sunday morning, they could introduce like a fake priest or whatever, but actually a story mage, and he starts the sermon. Oh, this is a great idea. Now, this is how I do the church thing. Okay, so he starts to preach and sucks everyone into the story stasis. And in the meantime, as long as he's telling that story, in the meantime, the enemy can enter the village undisturbed because everyone is in church and they can actually rob the place or burn it down or whatever. So it can be used as a weapon. Here, we don't know all this. We don't even know what's going on. That's what I want. I want the reader to have this idea like, what the heck is going on? And why is everything in the loop? And what is this person doing? And so he starts draining the color from the storyteller. And this is kind of a visualization of what he's actually doing, because his aim, and this has to do with the broader scope of my story, his aim is to rob stories from hope. He wants to change the stories. And instead of stories always having like a happy end, and the dragon is defeated, and people are encouraged by the story to face whatever, thing that the dragon represents in their own day-to-day lives. Anyway. So his goal is to take away the hope from the stories. And the antagonist, and I worked this out yesterday, if you remember, has actually in his mind, a very good reason to do that. He has a purpose, and the part of this is he believes that story should not have a good ending because it makes people passive. That's kind of his mindset. It's like, if stories don't end well, then you learn that the world is not a fairy tale. And so it encourages you to become strong, to weapon yourself, to start moving instead of just passively listening to fairy tales. Anyway, so there's this whole the underlying layer of the function of stories. And anyway, so you see that the color is drained. And then the next step in the prologue is that he's going to check in with the people that are in the story trance. But how do you do that? Well, he cuts himself in the hand or whatever, and so there's blood trickling from his hand. And then he walks up to one of the people that is listening. Maybe there's a woman who is clearly really enjoying the story, and he takes his knife and cuts her. And he gets really close to her. So I want it to feel really uncomfortable, like he's stepping into her personal zone. He gets really close, and then, he cuts her. Or maybe he starts first cutting her, and then you're like, what? Is he going to kill this woman? And then he cuts himself, and then you're like, oh, wait, no, this is something else. And then he actually mingles his blood. So maybe he cut her in the neck or whatever, and then he puts his hand with his blood on it, and that makes the connection. And all of a sudden, he is sucked into the story, and he experiences the story just like anyone else who is in the circle around the story mage. And in that story, again, I didn't write all this in detail. These are just like I just started writing paragraphs. Okay, so this should happen, this should happen, this should happen. I'm still in the outlining process. And so all of a sudden he's transported to a small island and surrounded by the sea, and you see some villagers, and there is a monk who is actually standing on the coast with a Bible in his hand and a cross in his right hand, and he is screaming at a huge sea dragon or sea monster that has risen from the waters and is about to attack. And the monk is holding him away from the people that surround him, and there are some villagers around him in the grass, and they're kneeling and they're praying and they're super scared. But this monk is standing there alone with his cross, and he is saying a prayer. And this, apparently it helps. It keeps the dragon from attacking, or the sea monster. Maybe I'll make it a sea snake or something. Anyway, and then all of a sudden he's distracted, and he's distracted by a beautiful woman that he sees in the corner of his eye, and kind of turns towards her, and then he returns to kind of corrects himself, returns to his Bible and starts praying again. And then again, he looks at that woman, and then at one point he's so distracted that he drops his Bible and he walks towards her and starts to talk to her. And that's when the sea monster attacks. And not only that, but all around the sea monster, other snakes and horrible creatures emerge from the waters, and they all start attacking, and people scream, and that's when our antagonist breaks the connection, and he, right before anyone else kind of wakes up from the story trance, he sits in a corner to observe what happens. And so the story mage in the center, drained, he's completely pale and even kind of gray skin, falls on the ground, falls forward, and everybody is like, what is happening? And they walk towards him and they try to wake him up. And in the story mage, it is like, this has never happened. This is not supposed to be how the story ends. This is what just happened. And then people are so confused and they're really like disconcerted, and they start talking amongst each other. Like, but why didn't anyone fight back? And why didn't they just like go after that priest and force him to fight the dragon? Or why didn't they just take up arms and attack and counterattack? And so they start creating their own version of how the story should have ended, but it's a version of the story where prayer is not keeping the sea snake at bay, but it's violence. And our antagonist sits in the corner and he is like, this is going so much better than I could have hoped. Perfect. And that's the end of the prologue.